Today, we're going to try something a little bit different. The Tools for Thought community is wonderful, and I thought it would be nice to peel back the curtain a bit and showcase the people and projects that are moving it forward. Quartz has been a major removal of friction from my personal content publishing workflow, and I recently got a chance to sit down with its creator, the brilliant Jacky Zhao. We talked about Obsidian, Tools for Thought, and what it's like building, maintaining, and debugging open source projects that thousands of people depend on. I hope you enjoy the chat, and I'd love to hear what you think of this new format and whether you'd like to see more of it. So without further ado, this is my chat with Jacky Zhao of Quartz. Jacky, this morning I realized that it was 2 years ago today that I posted the video on how to publish your Obsidian Second Brain online completely for free. So fun little
2
coincidence.
years, almost to the date, actually.
It's to the date exactly, wow. Completely by coincidence. And today I'm fortunate enough that you decided that you would chat with me. First of all, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. But two, thank you for the countless hours that you've put into creating and likely supporting Quartz has probably taken more time than creating it altogether. So thank you for that.
Of course. And yeah, thank you as well. I think that first YouTube video really kind of was the first bump in Quartz's popularity that it kind of helped a lot of people discover it. So equally grateful for your platform in helping boost Quartz.
Well, I'm glad I could help because it definitely helped me. I was in a situation where I had like a static page, but I never was producing content. And so when I found Quartz, I was like, okay, I'm already creating things in Obsidian. This is the natural jump to get me to actually share some of this stuff. But I guess for those who maybe aren't familiar with Quartz and somehow stumbled upon this conversation, how do you explain Quartz to someone who's never used it?
Yeah. I think Quartz has kind of expanded in scope a little bit since Quartz 3, actually. I think Quartz 4 you can kind of think about as like broadly a static site generator. A static site generator is something that takes a bunch of markdown files in a folder and turns it into a website. Specifically in the case of Quartz, it has kind of out-of-the-box support for a lot of nice features that people that use Obsidian, for example, kind of come to expect. So kind of graph features, backlinks, pop-over previews, and all the fun like Obsidian syntax that people who use Obsidian expect. It kind of comes out really nicely on the other side in the website as well. That's kind of the bulk of how I would explain Quartz generally. It's a thing that let you publish your notes as a website effectively.
Nice. Yeah, and it's probably one of the main ways people come across static site generators these days with Obsidian and Second Brains becoming more and more popular. I mean, not everyone has heard of Hugo unless they've been in the website industry or something like that. This may be an onboarding ramp for them.
Yeah, the onboarding ramp is definitely something to note as well. It's like, I think when a lot of people, go from note-taking to being like, okay, now that I want to share my notes with the world, how do I do that? It turns out that a lot of like static site generators really are highly technical to set up. I think Quartz specifically tries to emphasize just like you ideally should be able to set it up with as little like technical experience as possible. A lot of static site generators like Hugo or 11T and all of those other ones kind of require you to write the code from scratch to make your website look the way it is. And Quartz kind of tries to prioritize a more out-of-the-box working and then give you kind of the ramp to make it as much of yours as you want. So that's kind of like one of the baseline, I think, philosophies of Quartz is it should just like work out of the box really nicely. But if you want to make it yours, we should give you all the gears and knobs for you to do so.
Yeah, and that's kind of been my experience as well. Is I started with base Quartz, and then once I kind of got my bearings, I was like, all right, I want to tweak this, and I want to tweak that, and I want to tweak that. And at this point, I've probably tweaked most things, and so I'm a little nervous about what the upgrade path looks like, but we'll get into that here in a little bit.
That's hilarious because I think I've seen a lot of people who file GitHub issues. They're like, "Oh my god, I love Brandon's website. How do I make my website look like his?"
I'm sorry, I might have created some headaches for you.
No, that's great. It just means that people kind of can see the flexibility of what they can eventually do if they put the time and effort into it. So it's fun.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you can sink as much time into it as you want, but the base Quartz is so good that you can just completely leave it alone. I've seen plenty of people who they post the site and I'm like, that's a Quartz site, but it looks great. And so it's really like there's no downside there.
Yeah, thank you. That means a lot. I think over time it kind of best patterns evolve, and I think one of the things I'm really grateful for is there's so many community contributions that go back into Quartz that make the default installation like feel really good. A lot of it is kind of like I've put together some very hacky first way of doing it. Like the first iteration of the graph view in Quartz was really bad, and same with the first implementation of search. And luckily, a lot of people kind of find updating Quartz actually uh, enough of a friction point. They're like, I might as well contribute this upstream so that both me myself get the update, but also everyone else who uses Quartz gets it. So we get this really nice like kind of feedback loop where people are like, oh, I would have
Mhm.
actually really loved this feature in Quartz myself. So they kind of go back and contribute their feature back into upstream Quartz, and we get this like really nice feedback effect where I think even just like a few months ago, one of our contributors, Aaron, he added this like really nice like two pane search thing where you have like the
I
results
was
on
gonna ask you
left
about
side.
this because I saw
Yeah,
this on
yeah,
Twitter, and it's so good. Are you a Vim
yeah,
user?
yeah, yeah. So I was like, wow, I never thought about having that telescope like preview. For
Mhm.
viewer context, if anyone's watching this in the future and is like, what the hell is Vim and telescope and all this stuff? Vim is like a very like fancy text editor that's super pluggable, and one of the really popular plugins for it is this plugin called Telescope, which allows you to kind of do search over things, and show a really nice like preview pane and a search results pane separately. So Aaron also comes from like the Vim world as well, and he was like, we should just add this as like a feature to Quartz. So now Quartz is really awesome like search preview features thanks to people like him. So
I love that. Vim's one of those things, there's kind of a curse of knowledge of once you've done that, you can't unsee it, and you're like, I just want that everywhere now."
yeah, yeah. I think there's definitely two sides to it. It's like I think both Vim and Obsidian kind of suffer this curse where it's like I think there is this whole cult of like, oh, what is the best way to use Vim? What is the best way to use Obsidian? And it's kind of people kind of cargo cult into the so-called like best ways of doing things rather than trying to figure out from first principles what works well for them. And so yeah, that's like one of my maybe like one of my minor gripes with people who use Obsidian. It's like I think I also fell into that trap when I was first starting to use Obsidian as well. It's just like spent so long like, what is Zettelkasten? How do I organize my nodes? And there's a million other ways to do things. And eventually just had to find out what worked for myself. So
It's dangerous. It is really dangerous. I felt that with both of those tools. Like Obsidian, I feel like I got the hang of Obsidian a little bit
mhm,
quicker. Um, but you still there's this intermediary period where you think you've got a workflow going, but you're still second guessing it. And then
mhm,
eventually you'll settle into it and you'll feel comfortable. But a lot of
yeah.
people stay in that period for a really long time and have a hard time getting out of it.
Yeah, and it's especially hard when it's like if the workflow feels like too foreign, I think the friction point is high enough that you don't use the thing enough to overcome that friction
Hmm.
point. So that's kind of where people kind of I think happens with writing as well. It's like, "Oh, I'm gonna start writing more." They publish like 3 blog posts and then it dies. Same
Yep.
with note taking. Use Obsidian religiously for 2 months and then it falls off.
I guess, how did Quartz come to be?
Mhm.
Most people don't wake up in the morning and they go, "I'm going to build a static site generator today." I guess how did that
Well
come to be?
well, let me tell you a story about how I woke up 3 years ago and decided to build a static site generator. Um, I actually was in a very similar situation of feeling kind of like I wanted to write more, but I didn't know what the right kind of catalyst for doing that was. And I think 3 years ago, I was in a position where I was actually really scared of like showing up online in ways that were like,
Hmm.
if I like post something that's, wrong, what if people make fun of me and are like, this guy does not know who he's talking about. Why is he allowed to even post things online? And whole
I
spiel
love
on
how
them.
the people who shouldn't think about these things are the ones that dwell on it way too long.
Exactly. It's like the people who actually shouldn't be posting online are like, "Oh, I totally should be posting online." But yeah, not to get sidetracked, but the whole, thing was just like I felt, yeah, I needed some way to kind of lower the friction for me to, I think, put my work and put my writing online in a way that was like make it a really easy habit for me to just like publish, writing
Hmm.
online. And at the time, I maybe started using Obsidian for about like 3 or 4 months, and, I was not ready to commit the steep price of paying for Obsidian Publish yet. Don't get me wrong, Obsidian Publish is a great tool, but at the time I was still a student, and I was like, I'm not about to pay, like a monthly fee for this. And I was already using Hugo for my own personal website at the time, so I was
Hmm.
kind of wondering what is like the minimum set of changes I needed to make to Hugo to kind of make it work for Obsidian. And that kind of birthed kind of maybe the V1 you could think about of Quartz. I didn't call it Quartz at the time. It was more just a framework for me to work on my own personal website. I kind of
Mhm.
incorporated more and more of the Obsidian features over time. But at some point, I remember showing it to a friend, and my friend was like, "Hey, I use Obsidian too. I would use that tool to help me publish my website." So I was like, maybe there's like something here to kind of abstract, and if people wanted to publish their Obsidian vaults as websites. And at the time, there weren't actually that many Obsidian Publish alternatives. There was a few. I think there was one that was like based off of Jekyll, um,
Mhm. It
and
was fairly basic.
yeah, yeah, and I remember, like, using it, and it's just, like, the experience of using it wasn't super great, um, so I was wondering, like, if how I could, like, kind of improve on that, and I thought at the time, like, Hugo was the best way to do it because it was a static site generator a lot of people were kind of sort of familiar with already,
Mhm.
but, it still had enough flexibility that I could kind of do a lot with it, and that kind of birthed yeah, Quartz 1 through 3 were based off of Hugo, and, a lot of the early work there was just kind of making Hugo play nice with Quartz and all that processing stuff, yeah.
So that's probably a good segue into my next question, which is we're now on to Quartz 4. And
Yeah.
I'm curious, in those early days, how do you know when a new version is coming about? Like, how do you
Yeah.
differentiate between a 1.0 and a 2.0?
Mm, that's a good question, and, I wish I had a better answer for the first 2 versions. There is this thing called SEMVer, or semantic versioning, that exists
Mhm.
in the software realm that kind of allows you to demarcate between, like, backwards incompatible changes. So it kind of goes by, like, number dot number dot number, and the number is generally the first number corresponds to, like, the major patch version, the second one is a minor, and the third is a patch. So third, the kind of granularity goes, like, 1 is like, "Oh, everything is changing." 2 is like something's changed. The semantics are generally the same, but there's probably some like small incompatible change to be worried about. And the third number is kind of more of like a performance improvement or something that doesn't change like the
Mhm.
consuming side. So to anyone who's using the API, it shouldn't be any different. So since like Quartz 3, we've tried to follow Semver pretty accurately. So the kind of differences between like 1 and 3 were actually not that big. It was mostly just like adding new features, and every time I wanted to like announce a big new feature, I would increment the big number.
It's a great way to get people's attention.
Yeah, yeah, I was like, "Oh my god, new big major version. Time to do a marketing thing." But yeah, it was really fun because I actually had no idea how to side tangent, but, like, I didn't know how to promote or advertise Quartz at all, and I remember the fact that, like, when I made Quartz 1, actually, I posted on Product Hunt, and, like, I think 3 people upvoted it, and I was like, Nobody needs this, actually." And I
I think
was
that's
just like
actually more votes than I have on Product Hunt, so you're good.
Yeah, so at the time, I was just like, "Well, even if nobody's gonna use it, I'll keep developing as a tool for myself." So, if anything, it's a sign for people. It's like if you make stuff for yourself, eventually enough people will consider catching on. As to answer your earlier question about, like, when something is worth having a new major version, I think like, you could probably think about it like a house. I think, Quartz as a house was starting to leak and creak all over the place. It just wasn't really working. The complexity kinda comes down to a lot of what Quartz is trying to do is a little bit incompatible with how we kind of think about what Hugo is really doing. Hugo,
Mhm.
effectively, you have some markdown and you turn it into content, and then you template that content into some HTML looking thing. But Quartz, and you can think of as most publishing tools, have like this intermediary step where you need to transform some aspects of the markdown into something that's more compliant that can be more
Mhm.
easily turned into HTML. So a lot of things that are like custom Obsidian flavor, like backlinks and embeds and stuff like that, were really, really difficult to do in Hugo's like transforming pipeline, which under the hood uses Go templates. And there was like a really, really gnarly way to edit it. We had like this really one big template file that had is like honestly impossible for anyone outside of the contributors to really
Mhm.
understand or contribute to. So that was like a really big code smell for us, which is like this is like driving people away from using Quartz. It is really a pain in the ass to update. And every time I even like thought about working on Quartz, I was like, ugh, I don't want to touch that file. Um,
Mhm.
And when, you know, something that is open source and something that you work on in your spare time no longer becomes enjoyable to work on, I think
Hmm.
that's like a really big warning sign that something's gone wrong somewhere. So for me, there was some breakage point where it's like I cannot sustainably keep working on this. There was feasibly like two main paths for me to really go down. One is kind of abandon working on the project altogether and just leave it as is, or two, try to rewrite it into something that's better and more worthwhile for me to spend my time on. I almost actually went down one,
Hmm.
um, but I ended up kind of thinking like this is something I still use in my day to day at the end of the day, and if I want this to be something I enjoy spending time updating and working on, I should. That's like a time investment that I'm willing to make. So that kind of initiated the kickoff of the rewrite of V4 starting kind of things like last maybe almost exactly a year ago to it's like right at the tail end of March or April, I think.
So do you just own the stack all the way down, or is there a different intermediary layer?
Yeah, I think you can always think about software stuff as like layers and layers of abstraction. It's very hard to kind of say that anyone really owns like the stack all the way down. At some point, you get to the computer level, and you don't own the computer. You know, somebody else made that. um, but I think Quartz 4 goes much lower down the stack, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
Um, Quartz 3 was very much just like plugins and templates on top of Hugo, whereas Quartz 4 pretty much is like a from the ground rewrite. It's effectively like we created a new static site generator engine using Node.js that turns
Mm.
React-like syntax into HTML. It doesn't actually even run React at all. It runs this like it just uses the React-like syntax to make it easier to template. Um, and yeah, we kind of created our own plugin system from scratch for it. It really relies heavily on the unified parsing ecosystem. So you can kind of think about programming languages as this like structured thing, as more normally just like text. And when we want to kind of write transformations over text, it's much easier to think about it as like trees of syntax. And so unified is this open source library that allows you to kind of parse these really large pieces of code and pieces of markdown as these trees of syntax that make it a lot easier for people to write plugins for and think about how to transform it. When we were still in kind of the Quartz 3 world, we were doing a lot of like regex find and replace, which ended up in a lot of really gnarly bugs where it's like if you had a transclude block in a code block, it would kind of try to insert a link in a code block, which
Hmm.
obviously didn't make sense. And so there's a lot of contextual things that like, oh, this type of syntax is only valid in this context and whatnot that is really hard to represent in terms of just string transformations. So unified kind of leverages like this parsing ecosystem to kind of give us the syntax tree, and we can be like, oh, we only want to do this sort of find and replace if you're inside of a text block, or and it makes it a lot easier to kind of express the semantics of what Obsidian is actually trying to represent under the hood a lot easier. So we kind of leverage this unified ecosystem a lot, and kind of the two branches of unified is you have Remark and Rehype, which a lot of other static site generators leverage for their markdown as well. So Remark is kind of the markdown side of the ecosystem. How do you kind of manipulate markdown nodes and do transformations on them? And then Rehype is the HTML side. And then there's this like magical plugin that sits in the middle called Remark-Rehype that does the transformation between the two. Um, so within the kind of the Quartz 4 ecosystem, there's like this pipeline of you go from raw file, which is markdown, which gets parsed by Remark into the syntax tree. We run all the Quartz transformer plugins on it to get some resulting thing, and then we use Remark-Rehype to kind of transform that into HTML. We do a little bit more transforming on that, and then we insert that into that JavaScript React looking thing, and then do all templating there. And then at the final end result, you get some HTML file. So that's kind of like the single pipeline, or for a single like file for a piece of Markdown. And that's kind of, we run that for every single thing and then do a bunch of optimizations around it. But the TLDR is effectively turning Markdown into some intermediate representation into HTML.
Thank you so much. So that seems infinitely more flexible now because you don't have to deal with all of the Hugo quirks.
Exactly.
So as long as Remark is good, which it is, and as long as Remark-Rehype is good,
Yeah.
then you've got two different templating layers that you can use in between to kind of get the output that you want.
Exactly, and we actually even expose the plain text level as well if you want to do transformations at the level as well, although we don't really recommend people do it. If you're trying to do something at that layer, you're probably doing something wrong, but yeah, the general idea is that we can kind of leverage existing ecosystems instead of trying to reinvent everything from scratch. The Rehype and Remark ecosystems have a lot of kind of community support built around
Hmm.
them over the years. Like Astro, for example, uses Remark and
Hmm.
Rehype under the hood, and a lot of other really popular JavaScript-based static site generators use it under the hood. So a lot of people kind of built these like shared plugins that we can kind of also bring into our own ecosystem. So when somebody asks like, "Oh, how do I add like latex support using this like Remark thing?" And then we can just be like, "Oh, there's a Remark plugin for that. You can just install it this way."
It's
And
like
it
this
makes it
is
just
now
like,
possible instead of
yeah,
being like, you don't realize how much trouble that actually is.
it's kind of hard.
Speaking of trouble, I'm curious, what is the gnarliest bug you've had reported to Quartz?
There are numerous bugs. I can give you a choice between like gnarliest to solve or Um, like, weirdest thing I've learned as a result of it.
So I guess just to give you some context, I have two Obsidian plugins,
Yeah.
and most of the things I get are it doesn't work on my machine. And then my
Mhm.
first thing is, all right, well, what configuration are you running?
Yeah.
Because most of the time it's just weird configurations that I never even considered.
I'll give you some context there. There's a very specific Windows build. I don't have a Windows machine. I program on a Mac. So for me to test on Windows is actually really hard. And
Hmm.
there's this whole class of things that happens on Windows that is actually really hard to diagnose elsewhere because Windows kind of treats paths differently. So in the kind of very early stages of writing Quartz 4, I was like, I actually don't have enough people that I know that run Windows for me to
Hmm.
make sure that Quartz works well on Windows for. And there was a very specific weird class of restart bugs where Quartz 4 has this like hot reloading feature where after you type text, it'll kind of dynamically update the locally generated website to kind of match what you've just edited. And our initial implementation that was pretty naive. It was just kind of delete the content and delete the output folder, regenerate everything from scratch, and then make the output. And I thought that was like a pretty safe way to do it, right? Like that's pretty atomic. But it turns out that like Windows is significantly slower than I/O and like file operations than
Mm.
Mac or Linux are. So you kind of get into this weird state where sometimes you end up the delete doesn't end up finishing before you end up creating the new files from the next refresh, and you get inconsistent builds, but only some of the time and only on Windows. And for me,
And if you were
it
to
kind of,
rerun it, it would probably be
yeah,
fine the
and
second
they were just like
build.
stop and rerun it. You can't reproduce it. So I was like, this is impossible for me to debug. And eventually, like one of our community members spent a lot of time kind of getting a solid reproduction of the bug. And a lot of it just came down to like, how do we do asynchronous synchronization between all the different threads and whatnot. So that one was really weird. There's a lot of really also like funky JavaScript ecosystem bundling stuff that is really difficult. If anyone listening has worked with JavaScript, you kind of know the whole like ESM, CJS,
Hmm.
Node.js, everything around that is really confusing and hard to think about.
And
And the
rapidly
kind of
changing at all times.
yeah, now Bun's on the scene too, so you have to think about Bun support and all the things. And so a lot of that complexity is definitely surfaces some of the time when you're developing Quartz. And a lot of when we're first thinking about developing Quartz, like hot reload is kind of difficult because we also want it to work for source code as well. So not
Hmm.
only should Quartz hot reload when you edit Markdown files, but if you edit the Quartz configuration, that should also reflect when you hot reload. And hot reload is a notoriously difficult problem that, you know, even Webpack and a lot of other really big open source projects still struggle with. So it's definitely something that we see in Quartz land as well. So that's reflected there. And then recently there was this weird Unicode like bug where I didn't even know you could have tags that are emojis in Obsidian. Like this is a thing. But
Hold on,
specifically,
hold on. Let's spend a second here. So beyond just emojis, you can have tags that are emojis.
yes. So, you know, when you
Okay, so
tag
like a hash
you
and then
a
an emoji,
hashtag
and that's
and
a
then
valid tag. Okay.
yes, that's a valid tag. But did you also know that there was tag hierarchies in Obsidian? So you can do slashes in your tag,
Yes.
and you do like A/B. It would can be considered a part of A. So the first implementation was that
What could go wrong?
emoji tags work fine in Quartz, but as soon as you have, um, the gear emoji in the second part of a
Mm.
tag hierarchy, it breaks. And I was like, "This is a really weirdly specific bug that I really could not figure out for a really long time," and it
And it
turns
was
out
just the gear.
it was just
Other
the gear.
nested emojis are fine.
No, nested emojis are fine. Just the gear emoji screwed it up on only in nested, and I was like, "What is going on?" And it turns out there's like this really weird part of the Unicode specification that was like, "Oh, this gear emoji is a diacritic symbol that's meant to be combined with other ones, but not all JavaScript engines that implement regex respect that using the Unicode property." And it was just this whole mess of like, "Oh my god, Unicode is so hard. Why do people do this at all?" It ended up being like a one character change to fix it, but it was really really something. I think it's just a lot of this stuff is like once enough people start using it, there's just so many edge cases that you end up discovering. I'm sure like as like a maintainer of 2 Obsidian plugins, you probably find out, it's like, "Oh my god, I didn't even know you could use Obsidian that way."
Mhm.
It just ends up
Yeah, well, that was one of the ones I ran into is for the reflection plugin. What the reflection plugin does is when you have a daily note for today, it'll show
mm,
you past daily notes from previous years.
mhm,
And so mine is just a flat file where all of the yearly notes are together, all the monthly notes are together, and all the daily notes are together.
mm,
What I didn't realize is some people nest those. And so they'll have a year folder and then they'll break out each month into its own folder and then they'll break out each week into its own folder. And so
yeah.
I didn't know I needed to do a recursive search of all of these folders because
Aw,
I
that's
didn't think anyone would do that. But now that I've seen it, it's a reasonably valid way to do it. It's just
yeah.
never crossed my mind.
Yeah, and speaking of folders, folders are also just so tough to deal with, and, we were speaking before this conversation, but one of the gripes I think Brandon had with Quartz 3 is you could just never get the folder resolution to work properly. And one of the
Yes.
actually really big bugs in Quartz 3 that we never got around to fixing because of just, like, how annoying the codebase was to work on was that we actually never supported any other link resolution strategy other than absolute.
Mm,
So in Obsidian, there's 3 ways you can resolve links. There's the absolute setting, there's relative, and shortest. And so a lot of people who came to Quartz were like, "Oh my god, my links don't work at all. Like Quartz is completely broken for me. I don't know how to use this at all." It just turns out we're using something other than absolute, which may have been the case for you as well.
that is totally my issue. Is there a lot of I think if I was running shortest strategy, it would probably work because my Obsidian Vault is weirdly nested. Not because
Mm,
I think Obsidian should be nested. I don't, but I treat my second brain as my private second brain and then also
mhm.
my public second brain. And so I have folders for people and I have folders for personal stuff. And that's sort of how I segment and keep the stuff that's truly private while being able to
Yeah.
share most of it publicly.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's just like, yeah, it's at the time, it's just folders were really hard to think about. And
Totally.
trying to figure out even what 'cause Obsidian doesn't even very clearly document what they mean by shortest link, for example, right? Like,
Hmm.
um, does that mean that if you have, refer to a note called, um, Quartz, right? Does that you if you have the same note in multiple nested folders, which one do you resolve to? And it's just like a lot of ambiguity in kind of how to interpret a lot of these options, and especially when you kind of work with something that is also constantly evolving. Like Obsidian has also grown a
Hmm.
lot since we've started using it so many years ago. So kind of trying to keep up with a rapidly evolving spec is also really difficult as well. So a lot of yeah, mutual difficulty.
All right. So I think you've hinted at some of these, but I'm curious, what would you say the hardest on one end and the most rewarding on the other end aspects of open source?
Oh, open source. Age old question. I think one of the really hard parts, I think there's like maybe like distinctly two really hard parts of open source. One is kind of because it's open, making sure that people kind of at all like skill levels and knowledge levels are able to kind of come in and know how to use and contribute to it.
Hmm.
Like I think that's true for any product, but specifically for open source, I think the this is really kind of the second part of the thing is people I think assume and take for granted a lot of the maintainers' time when it comes to providing support on open source projects. They kind of just assume that like, oh, it's an like what makes an open source thing different from like a paid product?
Hmm.
And for them, it's like they couldn't care less. It's like a thing that they just use, right? And so a lot of
Hmm.
people kind of end up making these really like bug reports and feature reports without even really reading the documentation or trying to find the answer for themselves. And like as a maintainer, it's like maybe that's fine on like a if you get one or two one-off like issues or whatnot, but if it comes like day after day, like over a
Mm.
year, it really adds up and takes a toll on kind of how you think about contributing back to the community. Because I think especially with software, it's really hard because the people that are vocal are the people that are experiencing the most difficulty getting it to work for them.
Hmm.
So the only people that you really, really hear from are like, "Oh my god, I can't get your thing to work." Like everyone else seems to have it working, but I can't get it to work. Or two, it's like, "I want this feature, you don't implement it. I don't want to implement it myself. You should do it for me." So a lot of just like people kind of taking time for granted, and it's really hard because it's hard to see all of the positive impact. I think that
Hmm.
you effectively open source is a donation of time, right? It's like you're doing stuff for free, um, and I'm obviously very lucky to kind of be in a financial position where I don't have to worry like super much about the financial sustainability of my open source work. So that part I'm really grateful for. But it's just yeah, equally difficult when it's like you still volunteer your time and people still take it for granted. So I think that part about it is really hard. And I've talked with a few of the other Quartz maintainers about making sure that they kind of take a healthy approach to maintaining because I think you can really
Hmm.
easily burn out from maintaining open source. It's just it's definitely really taxing for sure. Um,
Yeah, it's really tough. I mean, you come in with like the right mindset, and then just one negative comment or
yeah,
boneheaded comment, it just can really wreck your day. And it's like enough of those in a row, and you're like, why do I do this?
yeah, it's like
But then you see people who are using it, and you're like, okay, this is why I do this.
yeah, and yeah, to answer the second part of the question, it's like seeing so many different people from across the world use like the software that you make, and I think and you ask like maybe 90% of software engineers why they do what they do, and a lot of it kind of comes down to like I love seeing people use the stuff I make, right? And
Hmm.
I think that's true for a lot of like not even exclusive to software engineers. People love being, recognized for the work and being able to help others.
Hmm.
And that's very true for open source as well. And I think for me and a lot of other contributors, being able to kind of see all the different things people would make with Quartz is one of the most like maybe one of the most satisfying things to kind of come out of it. I know like there's PhD students that have written their theses on Quartz, like elementary and middle school teachers that put their curriculums on it. And just like
Hmm.
the diversity of people that kind of use Quartz continues to astound me. And I think that's like maybe like most definitely one of the highest reasons why I still like work on Quartz. It just yeah, it's just like you never know when I've even just like met people like at events that are like, "Are you the guy who made Quartz?" And it's like, "I use that for my personal website." And it's just like really interesting to kind of come across a world where it's just like people depend on your work for like how they present themselves online. I think that's really special.
That's really cool. I mean, I like to think of it as you're removing friction from the publishing process, which
Mhm.
enables people who maybe wouldn't otherwise publish to publish. I know that was the case for me. Is like I and you hinted at this earlier in the call, but
Mhm.
I didn't feel like I was writing blog posts yet, but I had these little nuggets, and they might be trash, but every handful might be pretty good. And so if I
Yeah.
can create more, I can curate later, but just I need to get that part out of the way so that I can think and write and share.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think so much of like the creative process, no matter the disciplines, about getting the reps in, right? It's like
Hmm.
no matter what you do, it's just like do so much of it that it just like becomes quantity over quality. And there's this one anecdote that I come back to a lot. I don't know if you've heard about like this concept of like 50 pounds of pottery. I started doing pottery pretty recently, and I heard of this anecdote, which I thought was really fun. There was this like one like pottery instructor who kind of split his class into two groups. And the first group was graded purely based off of the
Mm.
volume of pots that they threw. And the second group was like, okay, at the end of the term, we'll grade you on the last pot you throw, make sure it's as good as possible. And you kind of would have assumed like the second one focuses on quality. You would have expected something much better from the second group, but the first group just ended up producing so much more work that they kind of very rapidly outpaced the second groups in terms of developing their skills and just like being able to get enough reps to figure out what works and what doesn't work. Because I think the second group is so enamored with getting it right that they just don't do enough things in the first place. And I think that's so true for like writing and presenting yourself online. And I'm sure you're familiar, like especially having like a YouTube channel. So much of it is just like doing the reps.
Oh, totally. So I've heard a similar story. There was a study with photography students, and they were graded based on that. And half of them were told that it was the last photo. And then anyway, the same net effect, which is the folks who took more figured it out. And then also they took more shots. So there's a quality aspect and then there's a luck aspect.
Yeah.
And the combination is there's really no reason not to just do more except for time.
Yeah, and I think like maybe one of the like best things someone can do as someone who builds platforms is to reduce friction for people, right? And even like at my day job, I work at a company called Replit. We build like an online IDE for people. Our main goal here is also just like reduce the friction for people to write software. And I think a lot of my life's work kind of culminates down to like how do we reduce friction for people to do things that are meaningful and worthwhile to them. And that's kind of, yeah, it's like everything I do is hopefully in service of that.
100%. I'm on board with that too. I guess speaking of rewarding, you recently got an Obsidian Gems award for Quartz. What was that like?
Yeah, it was really baffling because I think at some point I was very like unaware of how proliferated it was. I think I there was always that like V1 launch in the back of my head where it's like, oh, I still had this mental state like not that many people probably use Quartz. Like I don't know, the first launch was pretty shoddy and I didn't know that many other people who were using it. I know there's some, online people who obviously really love it, but I didn't know how widespread that really was. So I kind of like made this random call to be like, hey, yo, I'm, was nominated for Obsidian Gems. I would really appreciate it if you voted. And there's like a whole wave of support on the Obsidian Discord that I was just really, really overwhelmed by in like a really positive way that was like, wow, like people actually really, really, really care about this type of work. And I think one of the parts that felt really, I think, great to me was that how also excited and happy that the official Obsidian team was about it. Because you can kind of think about Quartz as like a competitor to their official paid product, right? And so to me, like the fact that the Obsidian team still values and fosters like open source community products, even when it is in direct competition with kind of some of their paid features, is something that I think really stands out to me as like the character and kind of their philosophy behind how they build software. So I think, yeah, like two things. One, just like really grateful for so much of the community support and just like being able to share that with people was really great. I think my one of the things that we got as part of winning the Obsidian Gems of the Year was a few $100s in Obsidian credit. And for me personally, I don't use it on anything. So I was like, this is a really great chance for me to kind of give it back to the community in terms of rewarding people for stuff they already contributed. So there's this term called retroactive public goods funding, which exists, within the crypto realm, but I've kind of co-opted as this way of like, people who've already done good things in the past, but can still be rewarded for it in the present. And so, yeah, I really appreciate, I think Quartz would really not be what it is today without community contribution. So I felt it was very in place to be able to give back to the community in that way.
Yeah, I mean, the folks over at Obsidian are just so good. I mean, like you said, they could see you as a competitor and they chose not to, which is great. Also, they recently dropped the price on Obsidian Publish by a good amount. So that's really cool. I think it's led to more people having access. Either they can have Obsidian Publish, which is really easy to use and very simple and basic, or they can use Quartz and then they can take that to the next level if they really want to foster something and expand on it over time.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because I think a few of the Obsidian devs have actually joined the Obsidian or the Quartz Discord and sometimes even contribute to conversations. So it's like funny to see kind of not only are they approving of it, but they're actively helping cultivate it as well. So it's something that's really really awesome to see. And I know Capano
Hmm.
recently posted something about this, about like file over format. Sorry,
Hmm.
file over app, which is I think
Yeah.
one of the really main core philosophies of Obsidian, which is like you should be able to like your data should not be tied to any particular application. It should be a format that is public and understood by many. And I think that reflects a lot in a lot of Obsidian's work with, for example, like Obsidian Canvas, which is now JSON Canvas, I think.
Hmm.
So like publicizing and opening a lot of their work to public is I think is something that I respect a lot. So
Yeah, a lot
yeah,
of really
maybe
wholesome decisions going on over there.
yeah, for sure. And yeah, maybe even we'll have a Obsidian Canvas implementation for Quartz at some point soon. So
That would be cool. Yeah, I mean, I just love how small the group is. It's people who really care. I remember when I published Reflection, it's built on top of the
mm,
Daily Notes plugin, the Periodic Notes plugin, and
yeah,
Liam Kane ended up reviewing my
no
PR,
way.
and then he wrote all of that, and I was like, oh, well, this is the right guy to be reviewing this.
That's
So
so awesome. Yeah.
it was really cool.
Yeah. How was your process in like um going from just like a Obsidian user to kind of being more involved in contributing plugins and whatnot?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it was mostly just solving my own issues and
Mhm.
then going, okay, I think someone else could find this useful, and then sharing it. And then you look out and there's like 500 people using it, and you're like, oh, okay.
That's
Like,
wild.
I know like you look at the banner and it's like that's a number, and then you abstract it and you go, no, that's 500 people who are using this, and it's like, all right, that's pretty cool. Like that
That's
feels
pretty cool.
good.
Yeah, yeah. It always just like feels good to be like, oh, more people find the stuff that I did to be. It's like stuff that even that you just made for audience of one ends up being
Hmm.
useful beyond that. It's always fun. Yeah.
That's really cool. So I guess speaking of other open source projects, I think you're up to like 47 repos on GitHub. So
You've been
what
cooking.
else do you have working and cooking?
Yeah, yeah. A lot of my work is um that I spend my time on nowadays is mostly at Replit. I've had the very fortunate opportunity to kind of be able to open source almost all of my work at Replit, which has been really awesome. So they care a lot about those same things of empowering people to create more software. And so, like two of the most recent projects that I've been working on, one is Pyrite Extended. If you've ever used Python before,
Mhm.
um, there's this thing called the language server protocol, which allows, if you ever use a code editor, you see those like red and or yellow squiggles that tell you where things go wrong. Um, so Microsoft has this language server for their official like Python integration, but they don't open source the full thing. That one's called
Mm.
PyLance. They have like a limited subset of it called Pyrite, which they do make public. So our kind of attempt was to see if we can bundle a bunch of open source tools plus Pyrite into one single language server so that people have like a more powerful language server. So within Replit, that's live today, and people can also just like install it locally if they use like NeoVim or
Mhm.
VS Code. They can kind of just like install a new language server and just get better features, which is always a nice and fun thing. Um, the second thing
What
I've
was your
been kind of
experience with Python before that? Like, did you know Python at a very deep level, or did you learn it throughout this process?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wouldn't say I'm like a Python expert by any means, but I've definitely written production Python before. I've done like prior to this, I've worked in open source in specifically like machine learning infrastructure. So there's this project called Bento ML, which allows you to kind of productionize machine learning like serving infrastructure at scale. So a lot of my kind of introduction to open source was through them actually. So I'm very grateful to them for a lot of their like early mentorship and fostering there. So I learned a lot of my like early Python through that, and um, eventually it was just like, yeah, the Python ecosystem could be so great, but it's a lot of ecosystem fragmentation for sure.
Hmm. All right. Well, those were the main questions I have. I'm curious, is there anything else that you want to promote?
Nothing for me to promote, but yeah, thank you everyone for listening and tuning in.
I think you've motivated me that I'm going to have to go upgrade my site to Quartz 4 now.
You absolutely should.
Actually, once we turn this off, I have a bunch of questions for you about that
Okay, for
process.
sure.
But
Shoot.
all right. Thanks, everyone. Cheers.